Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mark Berry. I'm the President and Chief Executive Officer at PARC, the Plattsburgh Air Base Redevelopment Corporation. I'd like to welcome each and every one of you here this evening. It's kind of cold outside, so we very much appreciate your turnout. We have a lot ahead of us today, but I think it's very appropriate that you get to at least see a couple of our board members who are here with us this evening, beginning with Gil Dukin, the representative from the city, who I think I saw over here. There's Gil. We also have Gary Douglas, who may be out of the room. Is Gary in the room yet? He's right next door doing some politicking. And also Henry Forten, who's the representative of Senator Stafford, is here too. And these are my bosses, so I have to be nice to them. Also here today is John Haru, who I know is the landlord, but in Washington he is called the site manager for the Base Conversion Agency. John's way back there. And finally our base transition coordinator, Kenny Hines. Kenny is the official liaison between the Department of Defense and the community. So any hard questions tonight, Kenny's going to have them. So is that all right? Okay, that's good. Very good. A couple of housekeeping items first. I wanted to remind you all there are refreshments in the back, and feel free to get up and go there as you please. Also, we have a great deal of literature here today put out by PARC. It's over there on the table next to Denny Doyle. And I hope that you'll get a chance to take some of that with you. There's some very good information in there. And if you have any more questions on it, we can get it to you. I'm going to find the rest of my stuff here. Tonight, what I'd like to do first is maybe give you a quick progress report on what's been happening at PARC. After that, probably a fairly brief presentation on this thing that we're calling a local authority. And then, of course, we'll open it up for questions and answers. Depending on how often and how long we have questions and answers, we may take a quick break. So those of you folks who are in the media need a quick exit interview, we'll give it to you so you're not on deadline. And then we'll go back, and I'm prepared to stay here as long as I have to get all of your questions answered. Let me ask the obvious question. Can you hear me way in the back there? I have a big mouth, so I'm not used to not being heard. There you go. Thank you. You're all set. When I talk about what's happened at PARC, I can only go back so far. My company, Cross Border Development Corporation, took the contract to manage and market the PARC folks July 1st, 1996. So at the end of this calendar year, our company will have been on base, so to speak, for about 18 months. So although for all of us in the community, the flag went down back in September of 95, and we've known about the closure now for well over 3 years, and it's been a very, very long wait, at least for Cross Border Development Corporation. It's been a very fast, hectic, and almost chaotic schedule. But there has been some changes, and as you can see, we've made some progress. When I started out there at PARC, we had about 11,000 square feet of space that had been leased up. By the January of this coming year, actually closer to December of this year, we will have leased or secured commitments to lease well over almost 370,000 square feet, which is quite an improvement, I think you'll agree. We have also made some progress with respect to our gross rental income. When CDC first arrived on the scene, our annualized income, which came from 3 tenants, was about $112,000 a year. As you can see, our gross rental income is expected to go well over $1 million by the first quarter of next year. And finally, we've made, I think, the most significant progress with respect to the number of jobs. Our couple of tenants that we had when we started back in July 1st of 96 had, I think, a total of 9 people working for them. And when I talk about jobs, by the way, I only talk about new jobs, and I don't talk about people who work for PARC. I talk about new jobs that were not in the community prior to July 1st. We started with 9 new jobs, and as you can see, by the end of this year, we will have created or secured commitments for the creation of more than 550 new jobs for the area. We're not at all ashamed of those numbers. We think that's a significant beginning to the reuse and the redevelopment of Plattsburgh Air Force Base, but we recognize rather candidly that we still have a long way to go. As I told one of my friends the other day, the good news is we've leased up well over 1/3 square feet. The bad news is I've still got about 1.6 million square feet to go. It's a very, very big facility out there. But as you can see, we've made some progress. And I think the future looks very bright also. As we speak, PARC is now talking to, negotiating with, or otherwise courting more than 32 separate companies who are looking to come to the air base. And if you add those folks up, their interests equal more than 1.3 million square feet of space, and their job projections would be well over 1,400 new jobs. Now, are we going to get all of those people onto the base? Not hardly. Are we going to get half of them? It's possible. Is it likely that we'll get at least a fourth of them? Absolutely yes, because that's been the record so far at PARC. Usually 1 out of every 4 people we talk to, we end up getting them as tenants. And that will mean another 360 jobs, new jobs for the area, and hopefully another 1/3 of a million of square feet in space. Now, just before we get into the subject of an authority, I'd like to size the PARC operation, if you will, to tell you where the money came from last year, where the money's going to go next year, and where it'll come from next year also. And this gives you an idea what our funding sources were in this past calendar year of 1997. And as you can see, we get a great deal of money. It's the large red section from my landlord friend John Haru, the Base Conversion Agency. The Base Conversion Agency is a Department of Defense organization whose purpose in life is to make sure that the federal government's assets are protected while this transition is ongoing. And so right now, PARC has a contract with the BCA, and our job is to protect and maintain those assets on behalf of the federal government. And not surprisingly, they pay PARC to do that. And as you can see, this past year, that totaled about $3.8 million. In addition to that, they've been paying directly our fuel bill and our electric bill, which is darn near another $2 million. So they pay most of the freight out there. Now, at least officially, by the end of 1999, their funds are going to be cut off. And we're going to be supposedly on our own. I would hasten to tell you that we are already begun informal negotiations with the BCA. We've made the argument to them that we're a very rural community. We're up in the middle of nowhere here in upstate New York. We think we're going to need more time than what's been given to become financially independent. So we're very optimistic that we will be the second Air Force base in the country. There's one already that's been given a longer than usual financial ramp down. We want to be the second one to get a longer than normal financial ramp down. But what we've said to the BCA is, look, don't just give us a handout. You can base your payments to us on progress. And what we've asked them to do is to consider helping us as our rental income goes up. And what we've said to them is, if we fail to fulfill our goals, then you don't have to keep pouring good money after bad. And so far, I'm pleased to say that we are well ahead of our original projections given to the BCA, but we still don't have an agreement with the BCA, and that's one of the financial liabilities that PARC has right now, is securing its financial future. Our other funds come from an organization called the Office of Economic Adjustment. These are the folks who help a community like ours adjust to life without the Air Force Base. Their funding is definitely going to be ended at the end of =99. In fact, that figure there is shrinkage from what it originally was. It'll be even smaller in '98, as you'll see. And this past year, our rental income will total a little over $400,000. And as you can see, we also got some funds from the state of New York, thanks to the governor and Senator Stafford and Assemblyman Ortloff. And finally, we have other sources of funds, everything from rock concerts to what have you. So it gives you an idea where the money came from this past year. Michael's going to put another one up there, and it'll show you where the money is going to go. And this gives you an idea where we spend most of our money. The dark blue is buildings and grounds. And that probably doesn't come as a surprise to you. This is a 5,000-acre complex with more than 1,000 buildings. You know, we have 1,600 residential units. We have several million square feet of commercial and industrial space. It's probably one of the largest physical plants in all of upstate New York easily. And we're doing that buildings and grounds work with about 50 to 55 people. The team is headed up by Art Graves. I hope Art's here today. He does a great job. There he is over there. He used to be 29 when he came to work for me. Now he's about 68. And Art's doing that work out there with his crew with about 1/10 of the manpower that the United States Air Force employed when they were taking care of the base. And at least to the untrained eye, we're keeping it up just as it had been kept up before. Actually, I might be able to find a few spots in the base where the grass isn't mowed too short, but they're doing a fantastic job, and as you can see, that's where we spend a lot of the money. We spend a great deal of money on gas and electric, and not surprisingly, we have administration costs, we have marketing costs, and some of our other expenses. And the The green section is our central heating plant. We continue to be heated by a single facility. In fact, you'll hear later on we're looking at getting out of the central heating plant business and converting many of these buildings into individual heating units. So a total cost of somewhere in the vicinity of $5.5 million for our operating costs. Next year, we think where the money's coming from. This is our best guess. We're just putting the finishing touches on our 98 budget. You can see we're still counting on a great deal of funding from the BCA, a little bit more money from the Office of Economic Adjustment. You can see the purple section, our rental income. It will be going up past that $1 million mark, which is very, very encouraging for all of us. And we're hoping that the New York State, we have reason to believe for certain that New York State will be there with some more money for us. And of course, some of our other revenue projected, including a pretty large air show that Robin Albert is working on for next June, I believe. July? Sorry about that one. I'll get it right. So that gives you some idea about the funds. And unless you think we've got too much money, I wanted to give you a peek into the long-term future. And that has to do with our infrastructure repairs. You know, PARC is like a city unto itself. We maintain our own streets and roads. We plow them. We fix our own sewer and water lines. If our electrical lines break, we fix those. Our stormwater drains, this is all done by PARC. There are no town or city crews out there to do that. So infrastructure is very important to us. And we've taken a very fast and dirty look at what's going to happen in the next 2 or 3 years. This goes out to the year 2000. And taken a look at where we could very easily spend a great deal of money. For example, converting our central heating plant to individual units. We could spend very easily over $8 million. We have some rail line out there where we expect to keep that up to spend several $1 million on that. Our aviation assets, the green part of the pie here, a little over $2 million. These are mostly maintenance and repair type activities, things that we think are going to have to be done either to keep these things in their current condition or to prepare them for occupancy or use. And of course, the large yellow section is our sewer and water infrastructure. And so you can see we have some tremendous financial challenges in the years to come with respect to our infrastructure. Now that's just the sewer, the water, the roads, the lights, and the central heating plant. We also have buildings out there. And as you know, we have a New York State Fire and Prevention Code, building code. And we've taken a look at just some of the minimal things that have to be done to bring our buildings up to code in the next couple of years. And stopped counting when we got to about $17.5 million. And the big red section, of course, is our aviation facilities, which are both our tremendous promise out at PARC, probably the best assets we have, but also very significant in terms of the cost to maintain them and to make them ready for occupancy. $2.5 million for residential type facilities. That would be converting housing units to individual heating systems, to doing these types of things. And also another $2 million for some of our garden variety industrial facilities. And the reason I bring this up and I show you these numbers, it's to remind you and to all of us, frankly, of that time several years ago when the closure was first announced. And our town fathers and our city fathers and our county fathers and mothers got together and met with the state officials. And there was unanimous support back then for an authority, or at the very least, a separate organization whose purpose in life would be to manage and market and redevelop the Plattsburgh Air Force Base. And one of the reasons for that strong interest in a separate organization is so that none of us would wake up some morning and discover as a county or a town or a city taxpayer that we were suddenly responsible for this tremendous financial burden. There was also concern at the time about the environmental liability. You know, we're on our way past $40 million in federal monies that's being used to clean up PARC, Plattsburgh Air Force Base. And we are, by the way, one of the cleaner air bases in the country. And they are on time, and I think, frankly, ahead of schedule in some respects, and it's a great bunch of people working on that. But there was concerns about the environmental liability back then, plus the financial liability. And this was one of the reasons back then, even before we knew that the federal government was literally going to tell us we had to be an authority or a unit of government if we wanted to take title. Even back then, the idea was floating around, and I think with great justification, that we should be by ourselves, that neither the county nor the town or the city should be forced to step up to the plate and take these financial burdens on because, frankly, the local taxpayers would not and could not support the the burden, the financial burden. I think also everybody felt it would be much more efficient and much more effective if we had a single entity, be it back then the Plattsburgh Intermunicipal Development Council, or today PARC, or tomorrow the PARC Authority, a single entity nevertheless, which would be solely responsible, if you will, for the redevelopment of the base, so that the marketing and the management came out of one organization. That is not to say that the town, the county, and the city wouldn't have a role. In fact, all of our town fathers and county and city people and state people said no. The county and the town and the city should have a direct role in how this goes, and that's why even today the 7-person park board is appointed by the mayor, the chairman of the county legislature, the town supervisor, your state assemblyman, your state senator, your U.S. congressman, and your governor, a 7-person board. And so even today we can recall the reasoning for setting up a separate organization. And what's made this question even more interesting, and I think the decision of our civic and business leaders some 3.5 years ago even wiser in retrospect, is the fact that now, today, the United States Air Force has said consistently across the country at base after base after base that if you wish to take title to these federal assets, you will be either an instrumentality of the state of New York, in our case, or you will be a unit of local government. And the record is very clear across the country that you must be either an instrumentality of the state, i.e. an authority, or a county or a town or a city. And interestingly enough, under the Base Realignment and Closure Commission rules and under the laws governing this entire process, they've added something to that over the years, and they've said, and if your intention is to reuse your air base for aviation, in other words, like what we're planning, aviation reuse, and you wish to take this base for free, which is a nice way of saying public benefit transfer, you want it for free because you can use it for the public benefit, then you will work with the Federal Aviation Administration also, in addition to the Air Force and the Department of Defense. And the FAA has even tougher and more stringent guidelines. And they are very, very clear that they're not interested in putting us into the airport business unless we have an airport authority, which is a little bit different animal, I think, than what you and I know as an authority like the New York State Highway Authority or even the Olympic Regional Development Authority. So the FAA is involved. And in fact, if and when this property is transferred, it will go from the Air Force to the FAA, and then from the FAA to the Park Authority, or to the town of Plattsburgh, or Clinton County, or the city of Plattsburgh, depending on who steps up to the plate. So I guess my point is, and I don't want to be confrontational or controversial tonight, but I have to speak very candidly to you about this. This is not Mark Berry's idea. This is not PARC's idea. And it isn't Clyde Rabideau's or Don Garrett's or Andy Abdallah's. This is something that's being told to us from up above, that if you want to take title, you're going to have to be something that they want to be, they want you to be, and that is that authority or unit of local government. And just the other day, for example, you might have read in the paper where the mayor of Griffiths is saying, well, we're not so sure we're going to go with an authority. If you read that article carefully, at least according to the published accounts, their county is apparently about ready to get into the business of being an airport and running what's left of that Air Force base. That can happen here too, if that's what the county taxpayers and the county legislature want. The same with the city and the same with the town. But it hasn't happened yet. I happen to think for good reasons. But I want everybody out there to understand that this authority isn't a power grab on the part of the people that run at PARC. It isn't a political thing on the part of elected officials. It's being imposed upon us. And until somebody or something comes forward with something that the Air Force finds acceptable and the FAA finds acceptable, well, we're going to be out here pounding the pavement and beating the bushes to convince you folks that we have to have an authority. And really the only question left is, can we make it as small as possible, and can we make sure that the control stays local? And that's, I think, a priority for all of us. So that's probably more than you wanted to hear about an authority and more than you wanted to hear about our progress. But it gives you an idea where we're coming from. And our prime goal tonight is to make sure that your questions are answered and, frankly, to get some advice. We can use all the advice we can get. And if you've had experience elsewhere on these matters or having to do with authorities, if you have some special concerns, we want to know about them absolutely as much as possible. I will tell you this, and I'll shut up and answer some questions. You know, even if you're on the right track, if all you do is sit there, you're going to get run over. And we're at the point in our community where we're sitting there. As you can see, we've started to make progress. I think a reasonable person would tell you that the redevelopment of Plattsburgh Air Force Base is now well underway after an 18-month hard run, and there's more progress to come. But that progress, the dream of more progress, the dream of seeing this entire base reutilized, is going to dim and eventually fade away completely if we can't amongst ourselves make a decision as to what form PARC will take, not just tomorrow, but next year, 5, 10, 15 years from now. And hopefully the city, the town, and the county can come together, come up with what makes sense as a local authority, a locally run, locally controlled authority, get past these folks in Washington, and get on with the business of redeveloping and reusing the Plattsburgh Air Force Base. So with that, I'll shut up. I'm told that there's a microphone in front for those of you who have questions, or if you're terribly shy, you can just get up and shout one out, although my audio people will probably shoot me for telling you that. So fire away. Yes, sir.
My name is Ted Robinson. I'm an aviator by trade, and I was at the last PARC meeting and asked a question concerning other closed Air Force bases. By name, what I brought up was Pease Air Force Base down near Boston, and Stewart Air Force Base, Rome, which has obviously been in the news. And I had this question because as a professional, I've been trying to follow what the plan is. And my question specifically would be this: what is the plan, the general aviation reuse plan for Plattsburgh Air Force Base in this context? Excuse me, in this context. Does this work somehow? I'm too...
I can hear you, that's all right.
Okay.
Let me say, and maybe what we could do is, before somebody's finished, we can get you a copy of PARC's strategic plan, which is very specific about aviation reuse.
Well, let me just finish the question
Sure.
if I can. What I would like to know, and I don't know this is not a rhetorical question at all. I don't understand what advantages Plattsburgh has with other airfields that are not being used to capacity. What is their plan as opposed to our plan, and why are we going to win that war? Okay. And the last time I asked you this question, it was about location.
And I didn't answer it very well because you're back, right?
No. Well, hey, listen, we all are time limited, and I understand. It's just that I don't understand what our advantages are. Maybe we have some things like hangars, physical plants, and that sort of thing.
Well, let me tell you what the plan is, and I'll tell you what I think our advantages are.
There was a two-part question.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
The second part is this. Right now, as I understand it, there are no instrument approaches to Plattsburgh Air Force Base. That's all been shut down. The only instrument approaches are to Clinton County. Now, when the feds come in and redo this, as I understand it, their position is that they will only support one set of instrument approaches to Plattsburgh, either the county or the Air Force Base. And the only other way that I know of to get in here is to get in here VFR. That means you go down to a minimum vectoring altitude by ATC and they drop you off into land. And I think you mentioned prior permission required to do all this. That's the only way I know how to do it. That's a problem in the wintertime. So if you could sort of speak to those issues.
Sure. Let me do them in reverse. And Kenny, help me out. We have an instrument landing system at the base now. We have one of the two that were there originally. It is operational, but it is not turned on. And we will turn that on, I think, when it makes sense to turn it on. But right now, you're absolutely correct. The 4 planes that we have landed since closure in September of '95 have come into our area, instrument rules to Burlington or to Plattsburgh, and then made a last-minute diversion on visual flight rules to the Air Force Base. That includes Governor Pataki's plane, Senator D'Amato's plane, a fellow from the Middle East that you may remember, and I think another businessman from up in Toronto way or something like that. So that's what's happening with our ILS. But the first question, I think, is, I'm glad you brought it up because I think it's important. Our plan, let me start back. Our mission at PARC is to create new jobs, to do everything we can for the social and economic well-being of the North Country, but to do it in an environmentally and a financially sound manner. Our specific plan, in order of importance, is aviation reuse, industrial reuse, and then all the other things out there that are social, cultural, recreational, historical opportunities. And going back up the list with respect to industrial reuse, we're hoping to employ an environmental or eco-environmental, eco-industrial theme. But I think your primary interest is aviation. That happens to be our primary interest. So let me talk about our aviation reuse plan. We see 3 opportunities. We see an opportunity to attract companies who engage in aircraft maintenance, repair, and overhaul activity. We see an opportunity to attract companies that are engaged in aerospace defense work. and we see an opportunity to track companies who are engaged in air cargo activities. Now, how do we stack up against the competition? The answer in a sentence is that we happen to be within 1 hour of Montreal, and they're not. And let me be very, very specific. There are aerospace defense companies in Montreal with whom we are talking today who have been getting and will continue to get U.S. Defense Department contracts to do Defense Department work. To do that work and to get those contracts and to fulfill those contracts, there is a certain minimum percentage of U.S. content that must be in the product that they make, be it a rocket ship, a jet, a plane, or a piece of radar, or whatever it is. So for those Canadian-based companies to fulfill their U.S. content requirements, they must have a physical location in the United States. Well, if you happen to be in Montreal, Quebec, where's the nearest place you can get U.S. content? Where's the nearest place you have aviation assets, can land a plane and do all those things? The correct answer is Plattsburgh. And not surprising, we're talking to a number of those aerospace defense contractors. We haven't landed one yet, but we're getting there. Air cargo is one of the other ones. It may surprise you, maybe it won't, but half of the cargo going in and out of Montreal either comes from or is going to the United States. It didn't take a rocket scientist, because I figured it out, that a lot of that cargo could land at Plattsburgh and be loaded on trucks and head south, which is where most of it's going, cheaper in Plattsburgh than it could be at Mirabel or Dorval Airport. And in fact, that's what we're being told by air cargo consultants and some of the people who are in the cargo business. And there again, if your cargo is coming from from Europe, from Northern Africa, and you've been landing it at LaGuardia and paying people there to get it off the plane and onto the trucks, and more people to get it on the trucks to the markets, and a whole bunch of people in between who are not necessarily incorporated entities, if you know what I mean, there's a great deal of shrinkage, so to speak. So we feel there's a tremendous opportunity, once again, because of our proximity to Montreal, which receives and ships out a tremendous amount of cargo. As I said, half of it either coming to or going to the United States, for us to siphon off some of that air cargo activity. And I think right now we're talking to 2 air cargo companies, we're talking to 2 consultants, who in turn claim to have interested people in Plattsburgh. So I feel we have that advantage against the other Air Force bases. Last but not least, aircraft maintenance, overhaul, and repair activity. And this is where the competition is the stiffest, because there are Air Force bases all across the country that are promoting themselves as being in this business, and they're looking for aircraft repair and maintenance activities. Here again, we get an advantage because we're close to Montreal, because there's a tremendous amount of planes flying in and out of there, okay? And again, our objective is to divert some of that activity over here. Now, not surprisingly, we're getting more interest because of a recent decision by the Airport Commission in Montreal to essentially shut down Mirabel Airport and to put everything at Dorval. Their international flights, everything. If you've ever been to Mirabel, on a good day, it takes you an hour to get from there to downtown, okay? There's about 23 tenants left at Mirabel right now, and we're talking to all of them. We're sending them letters, we're trying to get them on the phone. Their rents are going up, the quality of their facilities is going down, the service they're getting is getting poorer and poorer and poorer, and there ain't no more room at the inn. In other words, when I started in July of '96, the consultants that PARC had hired before me looked up to Montreal and said, 2 airports, lots of capacity. No reason for them to come south. They're shutting one down. 1 airport, not much capacity. Things are getting worse. PARC is in the ball game again. And that, again, is an advantage that we have over everybody else. If it isn't the Montreal connection, though, you're right. We compete head-to-head with these other Air Force bases, these other military facilities. We've taken a no-nonsense approach with some of these prospects. And we've not played lowball with them. As you read in today's paper, we're not going to prostitute ourselves for somebody who at least promises a bunch of jobs. What we intend to do is to abide by the rules of real estate, which is number 1, you never take your real estate off the market unless you have a damn good reason to take it off the market. And number 2, you make sure that the revenue you get from your leases will cover your expenses. And so we've had to say no to some people, but we'll also have said yes to some. And in the next couple of days, you'll see an announcement of an expansion that we have coming up for another 150 new jobs. And I think we're going to prove the point that we can compete, that we have an advantage, and that if ultimately, eventually, we will succeed. 157 Airport. They will only support 1 in each region. You don't have to be a Part 157 Airport and turn the tower on and turn your instrument landing system on unless you're landing passengers. You can land planes for repairs, you can land planes with cargo, you can land planes for aerospace defense work, and you never have to turn the tower on. You never even have to turn your ILS on. And all of those things that come in, they're scheduled ahead of time. And people call ahead and say, we're coming in for repairs. So we run out, we plow the runway. Hopefully they can land IFR. They go IFR to VFR. If we get enough traffic, maybe we'll turn our ILS on. But we can turn that on with or without the FAA giving us money. We just have to be able to pay the freight. What you're talking about is a rule by the FAA that they will not lend their financial support to 2 airports in 1 region. It has to be justified. We're not counting on, nor are we assuming that they're going to give us financial report. Until that day should come, if it ever comes, when it makes sense to merge the 2 airports that we have. And that doesn't appear likely right now.
So the ILS is not a published approach per se approved by the FAA?
No.
Local ILS, you can turn it on, but it's not...
If you check your NOAMs, I'm dangerous. I know some of the terms. It'll say that we are an open airport, but we're temporarily closed for repairs. It works. Okay? And we're going to be closed for repairs until somebody calls us up and says, can we land? And suddenly we're going to be open. And we've literally had X's out in the runway. We put them on, take them off, put them on, take them off. I mean, why turn on the tower if I don't have to? Okay, some other questions. Over here. Go ahead.
First question that comes to mind when I look at what's been going on here the last couple of years and having attended the meeting this summer at that overcrowded, stuffy office and so on, and thinking of the base as a facility, first class, world class, let's market it and this and that, and I think, why are we here? We got 5,000 acres worth of facilities, and we came here tonight to have this meeting. If I was trying to market the airbase, I'd have all you folks on the airbase and show you the facilities that are there and say, hey, see what we got? This is what we're trying to sell. Everybody get in to try to help sell it, because this is what we got. That was the first thing that came to mind. Most of these are going to be off-the-cuff observations, comments, and a few questions. When I went to that meeting during the summer, the thing that I had in mind, because I keep hearing almost like a one-track idea, this is all going to be industry, this is all going to be business, this is all going to be things that would involve a few jobs here and there. And at the same time, I'm looking at the base, especially the old base. I'm looking at the Battle of Plattsburgh right over here as I look out over the water. War of 1812 down here, the Battle of Valcourt, and we're right in the middle with actual line of sight to both events. Somebody pulls a big anchor out of the lake. Somebody else has a replica of the Philadelphia. The real one's at the Smithsonian. I keep thinking, the real Philadelphia should be on the old base, right where all those old historical buildings are. That anchor should be, that and maybe all of the base should be a world-class tourist attraction. So all the money you're bringing into this area is new money. You don't have to worry about whether it's going to be funded and subsidized this way, that way, and the other way. And if you get a facility of that type going in this area, not only does Plattsburgh stand to gain, all the region stands to gain, the northeastern United States stands to gain, and then you got all these offshoots like Amtrak stands to gain, all the airlines stand to gain. Because again, when I look at the base, I see a facility, to my mind, is unique in the world. And it may not be location, 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 but boy, is it access, access, access. Where else in the world could you come to a site like a world-class tourist attraction that gives you on-site rail, air, water, and the Northway, the highway? You can get to Plattsburgh Air Force Base by boat from anywhere in the world. You can get to Plattsburgh Air Force Base, obviously, by air. And as far as Amtrak is concerned, if you were looking for a place that people could get to, say, within an easy 12-hour drive during the day, I checked through the atlas and figured out if it's people like that would bring money to this area, within that 12-hour drive, there's 100 million people.
You know, you're sounding awful optimistic for a skeptic.
That's my optimism.
Thank you.
I haven't heard a word about any of that going on here yet, and that would be my main question.
Before I lose track of all your comments and questions, let me hit a couple of them, okay?
Good.
First of all, why are we here? Number one, because I'm cheap. We have some great facilities on the base, but frankly, to put you over there, I would have had to turn on the heat. I didn't want to turn on the heat. Most of these buildings are not being heated. We've got them pickled. To unpickle them, to put the heat in, and then to pickle them up again for one night of meeting, I didn't think was worth the money. So you can blame me for that. But number two, and this is the motives, I hope you don't question the motives because they were sincere and heartfelt, we thought it might be better if we went out and tried to reach out and get people. You know, when I was growing up, and even up until recently, I didn't know my way around the base at all. And if somebody said the PARC Forum is going to be at the simulator building or in Murphy's, I wouldn't know where to find it. And so I honestly felt and still feel that by going out into the community and having these forums, we become more accessible. So we're certainly unashamed of what we have out there, but we thought this might be a way to get more people. And finally, with all due respect, if there's anybody in this room that is interested in leasing anything in the basin, in other words, you're a prospect, come see me. But I was gambling that there weren't too many prospects in the room today. But let me tell you, when it comes to marketing the Air Force Base, we roll out the red carpet and we hit them very, very hard. We bring them onto the base and we show them everything we have, and that's when we turn on the lights and turn on the heat and do everything we can. So I apologize if you feel that you've somehow been disenfranchised here. It's mostly because I'm cheap, and also because we honestly felt we'd get more people if we came out to a well-known area in Plattsburgh. Let me say, too, that using the air base to house all of the historical artifacts that have been accumulated over the years here in the North Country, I happen to think is a tremendous idea. There's been little progress in that regard. Frank Papps, one of our local businessmen, has proposed a Revolutionary War museum and park out there, maybe even combining it with a new military cemetery. We have some great buildings like the barracks that I think would fit. I even talked to Frank once about housing that anchor that he pulled out. And I believe in our last newsletter, where's Denny? Correct me if I'm wrong. I thought we had something in our last newsletter asking for volunteers. Was that the one on historical resources? Right, we asked for volunteers to establish a task force, and as soon as I get your name, you're on it, so congratulations.
The main thing I want to know is, since you're hearing about all these feelers being sent out for all these other ideas, are there any going out to major, even international development companies of one type or another that would deal in that aspect rather than industrial?
In the historical aspect?
World-class, whatever you want to call it, a themed attraction, a park of some kind that would attract people from all over the world for that reason. Because we've got all this history, as everybody seems to be talking about all the time.
Yeah.
I haven't heard since the park started up that they were actually going out looking for people that would develop along those lines.
Yeah.
Whether it be the whole base or the old base.
I think initially when the PIDC first got started, they had talked to and possibly even solicited some resort developers, so on and so forth. I have to tell you honestly, though, since the Canadian dollar went down, this has been a tough sell to a developer. You know, the traffic is low, the dollar's devalued. Now, hopefully that's springing back. But I have felt, anyway, since I've been there, that our resources would be better spent looking at some of these aviation industrial prospects. That's not to say that we're ignoring the historical reuse possibilities, the recreational reuse possibilities. I think those are respectively 4th and 5th on our list. We're still out there, but we haven't made an awful lot of progress. And the effort has been certainly less than it has been with aviation. And one last thing is I want to give everybody an opportunity. I couldn't agree with you more about the multimodal advantages that PARC has. Rail, water, highway, and air. And we may have some news for you in that regard real soon.
Well, I noticed you had the same comment you made earlier this summer that the problem seems to stem from Canada, and all along in what I had mentioned last summer, I'm not thinking about Canada, I'm thinking about Boston, the greater New York City area, Albany, Buffalo, Philadelphia, as far south as Newark, and maybe as far west as Detroit. That kind of population, whether Canada is a fact or not, I don't think is necessarily relevant.
Well, maybe we can get this task force together and get, frankly, your opinions and a lot of others as to where the best opportunities lie. Thank you very much. Other questions way in the back here? And I'm sorry I can't see you well with the lights, but go ahead. There was no hand there. I was just saying, go ahead.
Mr. Berry, I'm Holly.
Call me Mark, please. Mr. Berry's my father, and he's old.
Mark, I'm Holly Bodette. 2 years ago, I put forth a letter of intent, memorandum of intent, to perhaps develop the base, the new base section of it, the housing for National Veterans Homeless Shelter. Tom Brokaw on television about 10 days ago made mention that 1/3 of the veterans across the country that are living in the gospel mission homeless thing are in fact veterans. And I perceive the base at this point as being a golden opportunity to perhaps house maybe 10,000 people that are laying on the streets, or perhaps some of those from the park across the way from the White House would be more suitable here, having a nice place to live. I think that it's possible if someone can take the project that I have put forth, a copy of it did go to General Coleman in the Pentagon, and it is ready to roll with, but I'm not the Lone Ranger and I'm not a veteran. And it would be nice if someone has interest in something along those lines, that it could certainly be room for someone to step forth and take the project from me and be a director of it or whatever to maybe get it off the grounds. These people, excuse me, would have, pension checks coming in. If money and continual income into the Plattsburgh area seems to be a concern that I'm hearing, these people would come in pensioned off by the government. They wouldn't be just out there and as dependents. It would also give a ready workforce at the base. There would be also another aspect of it of perhaps developing a search and rescue squadron of the semi-retired vets that have perhaps somewhat lost their way and yet were highly trained at one time, where the base's runways could be fired up.
Sure. Holly, with no promises made, I'm going to ask Denny to make sure he connects with you and gets a copy of your proposal. Let me.
But my work has a tendency of vanishing.
Well, I was saying Denny actually, but Dennis Doyle is our PR guy. But let me tell you very quickly that the law provides for the homeless in the base realignment and closure process. There's a law called the Mckinney Act, and under the terms and conditions of the Mckinney Act, when a base closure occurs, the advocates for the homeless have a legal right to come in, and they literally get first dibs, first shot at if you will, at these assets. And in fact, McKinney Act privileges were exercised here in the North Country, and a local group, the Evergreen Housing Community, came forward, and to this day, they continue to have option, if you will, on, I believe, a number of our duplexes, and at least 2 of our dorms, one dorm and maybe 6 duplexes.
Right, but that is piecemealing it out, and it's too small of a scope, and the problem is too large.
Well,
Federal money through DOT
and I won't argue what you're saying, but I'm telling you that the process provides for the homeless. But it's interesting to me that only one advocate for the homeless came forward, and even they, I think if you talk to them, will tell you that they certainly haven't, in the area, found sufficient homeless to justify the option that they have.
I also paid forward, and you have a few copies if anybody would like them.
Thank you very much. One thing you did mention, though, that's a favorite subject of mine happens to be veterans. And we've been very, very aggressive with respect to veterans. We have 3 different projects that we're working on out at PARC with respect to our veterans. One of them is the possible use of our old hospital as a possible veterans clinic. And those decisions will be made elsewhere, but we have pushed to have our site considered. Secondly is the possibility of a BX Smart. Just in January of this year, Congress passed a law that said they're going to set up 10 brand new BX Smarts. These are large BX commissaries for military retirees and the dependents. And we're in the process of notifying Congressman McHugh and working with them to ask that we be considered and our commissary be re-engaged, so to speak. And finally, you might have read not too long ago where we have some folks, Mark Purcell and Don Exford out of Watertown, whose proposal to us in its first phase is to establish a congregate living community for senior citizens. But what you may not remember is that the second phase of their project is a military retirees community, a military retirement community. So we're working very, very hard on behalf of the veterans to see what, if anything, we can do to help them. And hopefully we'll have made some progress in the quarter of next year, first quarter of next year. I'll go over here. Go ahead. Is that you, Shirley? Hi, how you doing?
Hi. Mark, it's my understanding that all state authorities, no matter what type they are basically under the control of what is called a control board, which is set up by the state legislature. And it's also my understanding that if an authority ceases to exist for whatever reason, unless prior provisions have been made, all the land and the properties revert to the state of New York.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of my concerns, you know, in talking about an authority for PARC. I'm also at a loss to understand why the city or the county or the town wouldn't be able to take over the property, primarily because of the environmental cleanup. The sludge bed on Cumberland Avenue on Wilcox Dock, Georgia Pacific was made in a subtle way to feel partially responsible for the problem there, and I fail to understand why our federal government is making us clean up what basically they did.
Mhm.
Am I right to assume that?
No, I'm not saying that they have or that they will. What I was reiterating was the historical context in which the PIDC was formed. In fact, I brought some of the news clippings with me that show that back then the town supervisor and the mayor and the chairman of the county legislature and the senator and the assemblyman all agreed that the authority was the way to go. Okay, and the only haranguing is how many Democrats would end up on the authority board and how many Republicans would end up on the board. So I guess everything's changed, but nothing has changed. But I think that back then there was a concern about the environmental cleanup. We've learned a lot in the years since. The Air Force and the government have acted very responsibly in that regard. But I have to tell you that whoever ends up taking over, they're going to deal with it too. We deal with it every day when we try to lease up properties. And we are told when we look at our reuse plan and environmental impact statement that if you intend to reuse a certain piece of property out there in a way different than the reuse plan contemplates, then there are going to be environmental considerations. And there's still a big unknown out there, and that's the underground plume of contaminants underneath the runway. I'm not saying that that should be an impossible obstacle for a city to take over, or a county to take over, or a town to take over. What I'm saying is that it was a consideration back then, and for some people it might still be a consideration.
Well, $45 million is a big consideration to me. But I'm really confused. I thought parcel A1 was the only parcel that was subject to an airport authority.
Yeah, which could be the city of Plattsburgh or the town or the county.
So essentially,
Shirley, let
following the
me.
base reuse plan,
Mhm.
parcel A2 doesn't fall under having to make a decision about an authority. Am I correct?
No, I think if the government would let us, you could establish an authority. The authority could be given just the new base, and the old base could just be left out there for whatever means of disposition you would like. I have to tell you, though, in my discussions with the folks in Washington, the Air Force is very anxious to unload this property. And at least right now, they don't seem to be very receptive to the idea that we'll let PARC take the new base and we'll worry about the old base later. In fact, when we were going over the record of decision, we asked them to give us just a record of decision on the new base. And they wouldn't do that. And they said, no, this is a package deal. We're going to give you the record of decision on the whole thing. So it remains to be seen whether they'll go ahead and allow us to do what you're contemplating. I think for a lot of people it might make them more comfortable, because the old base is in the city.
And I think so, and also, I don't know if you're familiar with the Saratoga City Center, but that's an authority with interest vested by the control board. And what they did, they set up an authority which had a lifespan of only 25 years. At the end of that time, assuming the liabilities and the bonds were discharged and the bonds were paid in full, the center would then revert to Saratoga City.
Sure.
And I think that's a wonderful idea. I'm not saying PARC should revert to the city, but certainly the city, the county, the town, something.
Yeah. I think sunsetting, if you will, an authority saying you're only going to last 25 years and then you're going to come up for renewal by the voters or the public, I don't think it's a bad idea at all. That's just my personal opinion. I think it's the policy decision the board's going to want to react to. But that might make us all feel more comfortable about an authority if we know that it has a limited lifespan. Your other points about the Public Affairs Control Board, that's absolutely correct. Authorities do answer to them in terms of reporting requirements, but the control of each authority rests with the board itself, the authority board, which is appointed by various means depending on which board you're in. And the last thing that you mentioned, I think one of the first, was when an authority goes under for some reason, its assets are redirected back to the state. That is usually the case in authorities. You have an opportunity in drafting this legislation to create this authority, to change that if you will. Maybe you want the assets distributed amongst the town and the city. But generally speaking, when you go to Albany and ask for an authority, they're there. And I've had people come at me from both ways, and some said, good, let the state have it, because there are that many problems out there. I don't want to get stuck as a taxpayer with a mess if PARC should go belly up. And other people have said, no, give that authority to the state. Because frankly, if they have to pick up the pieces, that means they have a vested interest in making sure that we do survive, and that increases the likelihood that we'll continue to get funding. So you can go both ways. I'm not sure there's anything you said that I disagree with. So. Other questions? Way in the back.
Good evening, Mark. My name is Mike Degnan. I'm a city landlord, residential.
Hi, Mike.
mentioned two things that are prompting this question. One, you said you had 1,000 residential units.
1,600 actually, but who cares?
And the second thing you mentioned was that you were going to defray the cost of that center heating by taking it, parceling it out to those residential units, which prompts the question, are you going to start competing with the local landlords?
Yeah. What I was referring to on the central heating plant was that right now we're heating about 19 or 20 major buildings and about 350 housing units. All of the other remaining units of the 1,600 total have been pickled. But there are 350 units that were really being renovated at the time the base closed. They are in excellent physical condition, and we're putting heat in there to make sure that they don't deteriorate. Because you know, when you abandon your house and you leave it unheated, it deteriorates pretty quickly. So the conversion process that we're talking about is primarily the 19 big buildings. The housing units, I'll be very candid, as you all know, the city wants about half of them. That'll be their problem. That gives me the other half. We're not sure how we're going to handle that. We have to make a decision of pickling those and risking that they will deteriorate. We have to look at, if the community is willing, the possibility of putting them on the market, or we have to continue heating them and of course convert them to individual heating units, which will be very, very expensive. PARC at this time has no plans to put any of those housing units, renovated or otherwise, on the market. The closest we've come to that is we have said that if we get a major employer in town, 200 employees or more, and if he can clearly demonstrate that he has the need for housing for a temporary period of time, I think 6 to 18 months is the rough rule that we have, then we would consider temporarily leasing those units to this employer's employees on two conditions. Number one, they got to get out within a limited period of time. Number two, whatever rent we collect, we will take a portion of that rent, give it back to the tenant on the condition that he or she build or buy a home in Clinton County. In this way, we ensure that we only put the houses on the market if there's clearly a demand for them. And even then, if we do it, we fix it so that the people in those housing units stay there temporarily, and eventually they are forced, literally, to go out and buy a builder home of their own. PARC is not in the business of doing damage to the existing real estate market. We've struggled mightily and been criticized, I might add, for saying no to people who, if they came on the base, would simply be leaving a hole somewhere else in the city or the county.
That prompts the second question.
So,
Would you ask them to pay a rent that was a rent equal to the rents being charged throughout Plattsburgh, which you undercut the current landlords? You have the ability to do that.
the outlines of
There,
the
I guess, is what I'm
the
asking.
outlines of the plan that I just gave you came to us as a result of a pretty well attended meeting with the Clinton County Board of Realtors. We had all of the officers of the board, and we had all of their principal brokers, I believe is what they call them, probably about 20, 25 people in the room. And they actually batted around some figures. And it was my impression that the figure they had, if it wasn't at market, it was very close to at market. It offered a slight advantage, I believe, to the people coming in. But you understand, the provision here is that these units would be used for people who are not here already. Okay, these are people from the outside. And even then, there'd have to be so many coming in that even the most reasonable person would conclude that an existing landlord in the city would not be hurt. You're welcome. Way back there.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, Mark. My name is Steve DeBray. I would like to commend you for your work that you're doing at PARC, and I'd like
Thank
to
you.
tell everybody that's in this building and to the viewers that are going to be on TV tonight that if they're so concerned about PARC, why aren't they here tonight? They have a voice. We have Representative Mr. Fortans from Senator Stafford's office. Mr. Orloff is, I'm not sure if he's here. Mr. Garrett's representatives are here. We as taxpayers have the power to either bring them in or take them out. If we're going to sit around and moan and complain about PARC, and if we're not going to make it an authority, if we are going to make it an authority, we have the power by just pushing the button. It's not the politician that has the right, as we as citizens and they as citizens have the right to say yes or no to PARC. I am for PARC and I support you 100%.
Thank you. Please tell them that I didn't pay you to say that.
I did not.
Okay, thank you. Way back there, I see a hand. Go ahead.
Hi, Mark. Bob Smith.
Hi, Bob.
The contemplated authority would seem to involve two areas. One, scope, and in other words, the nature of what the authority is going to be in charge of, in the geographical area. And you alluded to it earlier that there was a debate on how large this authority would be. Can you define that somewhat better for us? Because I think it would be, to me, I can't seem to get my arms around it, and I'm sure you feel that way sometimes too.
Sure.
But I think it would enhance the understanding of what we're contemplating as a community.
The first thing you might want to do, Bob, is to break this down into steps. The first thing that has to happen is the creation of the authority. The mere creation of the authority does not give it any property whatsoever. There's two decisions that have to be made. The first is a decision by the New York State Legislature and the governor to create this legal entity called a local authority. The second decision that has to occur is the one made by the United States Air Force and the Federal Aviation Administration, and that is, what part of this base, or all of it, or none of it, will they consider giving to the authority? Okay? And the second decision hasn't been made any more than the first decision has been made. Right now, there is a record of decision in place that says we will turn both the old base and the new base, partial A1 and partial A2, over to, in the instance of the new base, an airport authority, and the instance of the old base, to any eligible recipient. That's what the record of decision says. But there are contingencies, if you will, in that record of decision. And in the first instance, it says we're not turning the new base over unless you're an airport authority. And you've got till the end of 1998 to get to that point. And it says the same thing about the old base and whatever eligible recipient there is out there. And they say in this record of decision, there's a copy of it back there, by the way, that if you're not an authority or no eligible recipient steps up to the plate by the end of 1998, then we're going to go back to the law, which says we can either have a negotiated sale or a public auction. We can talk about that a little bit later. So to size the authority, I would tell you that initially it has no geographic size if you're referring to geography. It is a legal entity that hopes in the second part of this process to take title to a piece, if not the entire Air Force base. I'll give Bob a follow-up because I'm not sure he answered the entire question. Go ahead.
Assuming you get the authority granted,
Mm-hmm.
what size of geographical area and what scope do you envision that authority to intake, realizing you cannot speak for what the government is going to do?
Sure. I think if I had my way, the authority would cover essentially the new base. And I think the old base, which I don't view as critical to industrial and aviation redevelopment, would somehow be turned over to either the city or maybe some other entity created just for the purpose of managing and marketing the old base. You have to understand what lies within the city is 5% of the airbase. That's it. By almost any measure. In some measures, it's even less. The other 95% lies within the town. And frankly, that's where the action is. The old base to an economic developer like me is more of an albatross than it is an advantage. What do I do with all those marvelous brick homes? What do I do with the lakefront? You know, I'm not going to create too many jobs out there unless, as my friend has pointed out, we get really lucky with a developer. So that decision has to be made by a combination of PARC, the 3 municipalities, and of course, ultimately and eventually, the United States Department of Defense. On the new base, and that includes, you know, making sure that the golf course is operated, making sure the industrial park flourishes, and making sure that the aviation assets are used for aviation purposes. And you're allowed to do that even though the whole thing goes through the FAA first, because you can generate supporting income from non-aviation uses. Okay, so the FAA has no problem with us making money on the golf course as long as we dedicate it to the overall reuse. Okay. I'll go over here next.
Jim Andregor.
Oh, hi, Jim. Can't see anybody.
A couple of questions. First of all, if the scenario goes where you become an authority, number one, where does the funding come from, local or state? Number two, if this authority after being created and operating for a year or two and is not successful and folds, what happens to us then?
Exactly. The first question on the funding, you saw earlier, maybe Mike, you could put it up really quick for 1998 funding. I think the funding patterns that we're contemplating now could essentially continue if and when PARC turns into an authority. For example, we've been lucky 2 years in a row where we've gotten a chunk of change, thanks to Senator Stafford and the Governor and the Assemblyman, that we've used in part to renovate buildings and to do stuff like that, but also for our administration. I'm hoping and believing that that would continue. You heard that we have two sources from the federal government. One's definitely going to be cut off at the end of '98. The other one, the big one, I think we've got a realistic chance of getting them to continue that funding. They're going to cut it every year, but if we can get them to spread that out for another 6 or 7 years, and by then, hopefully, the third source of funding, which is our own rental income, will have climbed. You heard earlier that we went from about 110 grand to over $1 million a year in rental revenue. We've got to get it all the way up to about $6 million a year to cover the nut. Now, but your last question is the best one. What happens if you can't do it? Well, if you're an authority and you follow the history of authorities, when an authority gets in trouble in the state of New York, the state bails it out. Now, don't tell that to all my legislative friends in Albany, because that's one of the reasons half of them are against authorities. They don't want another burden. And as Shirley said, in many instances, the law that created the authority says that if and when the authority should fail, its assets and liabilities will go back to the state of New York. And that's a point for discussion. Some people may argue that we don't ever want to position the county or the town or the city to have to pick up the pieces after a failed park authority. They don't want that liability. Other people will argue that, yeah, I'll take the chance because I want control and I don't want to turn it over to the state of New York. I have no choice but to be optimistic, and that is that we're going to evolve into an authority and the authority is going to succeed. I wouldn't be at the job if I didn't think we could pull it off. Over here. Is that Eric? No? Go ahead, sir. Let's say John McGauley, sorry.
All right. Given my name, I guess I had two questions, but the first one has been answered, that ultimately, if the authority cannot pay its bills, the state would step in. Is that correct?
That's been the history in the state of New York.
Okay. Number two, if we don't have an authority, then I believe there's a prioritized list of what agencies can take possession of the base. I don't know quite how to ask my question because I don't know this.
I can help you.
Well, this order. Where would the Indians stand with respect to having a priority on the assets of our Air Force base?
Knowing some of my Indian friends, anywhere they want to stand. This is not an entirely simple question. There is no doubt that when a base first closes, Native American Indians have a clear legal right, and if one of their advocacy groups steps forward, and that could have happened here at Plattsburgh, you could have found yourself with a Native American group redeveloping the base. And for reasons that I won't go into, that did not happen here. Now, it is not clear to me, and if Kenny has anything to add to this, what happens, because no community has ever gone this far and frankly been that slow to react to a closure. So far, no community has reached the point where the Air Force has had to come back and said, okay, you can't get your act together, we're selling it. If that had happened, I might be able to tell you with a certainty that yes, when that happened, the Indians came back in, or the homeless came back, and whatever it is. It's not clear to me or to my lawyers what rights they have in the event that we fail to eventually take over the property, that in the event we fail to become an acceptable recipient of the property in the eyes of the United States Air Force. From what I'm reading, I think that's a possibility. But I can't tell you for definite sure that if we fail, the Indians get to come back, or anybody else gets to come back. Kenny, do you have anything to add to that? Or? I was afraid of that.
Rendezvous would be best when they describe at this point, since he's the landlord, but it's...
You see, that was the ball going all the way back there.
I'm not putting John in and trying to put him in a trick, but theoretically, though,
Yeah.
The Air Force could go back in and try to reopen streams, but I doubt that.
John, it hasn't happened yet, am I correct?
That's correct. That's my knowledge. Most communities that finally got their act together created something that was acceptable to the Air Force, the government, property, and things. Even in the case of George, California was. Now, there has been property transferred to Indian tribes. In fact, Warren, I think even had Griffiths, their transfer property. Okay, I saw your, so, but that is with the approval of the LRA.
The local reuse agency. Okay, good. Thanks, John, I appreciate it. Way in the back by the refreshments.
Mark Donnelly,
Oh, hi, Don.
aviation question. You know, I heard you say that it wasn't feasible to close the county airport and move it over to the airbase, but for a lot of reasons I don't understand that. Having flown out of both fields for many, many years, and knowing full well what you have at the airbase, you got a groove runway, 300 feet wide, 11,760 feet long. You got the most beautiful instrument runway in the world. In fact, the BRAC committee even noted the historical data that it has more flying days out of Plattsburgh Air Force Base than any other air base in the United States. My question is, flying into the county, you have a precision runway to only one runway. At the air base, you had one at both runways. I realize you don't have a crossing runway for the little puddle jumpers, but that's something that could occur very easily. You don't need about a 3,000, 4,000 foot strip. I don't understand, even if it cost us to pay to move Commute Air and some of the other facilities over there, I still think it would be feasible. I think it would be profitable and better to see that airbase operational and use the county property for other uses.
Don, let me say, first of all, I want to thank you publicly. Don is the, what's the official title? Code enforcement, or building codes officer, or whatever you are. Anyway, every time we have a project on the new base, we have to go to the town and get permission for our renovations, our building permits, and we work with this fellow, and you've been absolutely outstanding, and I just want everybody to know how great. Oh, I understand. I'm going to embarrass you anyway. You know, you all heard about the person who's looking at a glass and it's partially filled with water, and of course the optimist says it's half full, and the pessimist says, well, the glass is half empty. Well, if you're a real estate developer like me, you know what you do when you look at the glass? You say, you got a glass that's twice as big as it has to be. All right? And that's the problem that we have with Clinton County Airport. Our airport, it's not twice as big, it's probably 10 times as big as it has to be to satisfy what's going with the Clinton County Airport. And putting aside the logistical questions of the fact, for example, that the lights are 300 feet apart and it would confuse the hell out of all those pilots, we'd have to go through the expense of bringing them in closer. Forget about the fact that we would only have to and probably only want to plow a piece of the runway rather than all of it. And how we do that, I'm not sure. So.
That's 14,000 feet total runway. I realize they're not as wide as the 300 feet, but I still think it will cost that much to plow that one runway and keep that instant runway that's grooved. It's got a lot more capability than the larger aircraft. I can understand where some people might not want the larger aircraft.
And there may be some way of working that all out. I think the biggest single reason that we haven't pursued that has been the finances. There are existing leases in place at the Clinton County Airport. The folks at Commutair, the fixed base operator, so on and so forth. There's been a tremendous amount of investment by the FAA over there that I believe they get to recoup under certain terms and conditions if it's not fully utilized. We've been told estimates have ranged anywhere from $15 to $30 million to buy everybody out and move them on over. And it sounds extraordinarily high to me, but that's what I've been consistently told. But even when the numbers are confusing to me, I think one of the reasons I was hired is because I know a little bit about the political terrain around here, and I don't see anybody in the political terrain offering to shut down Clinton County Airport and come over to Plattsburgh. It just doesn't seem to be a realistic possibility at this point. And I might add, from my own perspective, the minute you start landing passengers, then I've got to turn on the tower, I've got to go to Part 157 with FAA. It's big, big bucks. And the FAA's dollars are shrinking. As someone said earlier, they're not going to fund 2 airports. But let me tell you, even areas like ours, when they're funding only 1 airport, and it's a relatively small operation like ours, which has maybe 25,000 enplanements and deplanements a year, it's small, they don't have an awful lot of money for it. And it scares me very much to think about getting into the passenger airport business, because it comes with a great deal of red tape, a great deal of expense, and there doesn't seem to be any money for it. And you know, even the best run passenger airport breaks even. Our airport, I think, is running at a very small subsidy by the county, probably $250,000 a year. Ralph Hencher's doing a great job. I'm not so sure that we wouldn't goof all that up if we moved them over. But if you have some specific ideas, maybe we could get together and talk about it, because every time I've tackled it, I've come up with some barriers that I just couldn't see being overcome. So, thank you, Don. Over here? Over there. Go ahead, ma'am.
Mark, Nancy McGauley.
Oh, hi, Nancy.
Hi. My question is, what are the steps and the time frame necessary if we decide to become an authority? What are the steps?
It appears to me to be a fairly straightforward process. Legislation has to be drafted. We would impose upon Senator Stafford and the Assemblyman. I think we'd probably get some help from the governor's office to have this legislation reviewed for legal purposes, to make sure that what we want is legally possible under the New York State Constitution. The legislation is introduced, and sometimes these things can be introduced in January, for example, and they come out the other end in as early as March. Others drag on and on. They get tied up into the budget process, and they don't get sped out until very late in the year. You might remember there was a home rule bill recently that allowed John Zerlo, who runs the motor vehicle department, our clerk, to get his records off papyrus or something. I don't know, it was some antiquated way of keeping records. They actually needed a piece of state legislation to get it changed, and his little bill, which really nobody should have cared about, everybody should have voted for it, got tied up in the politics in Washington and bounced around there for almost the entire legislative year. So the process is simple, but it's also unpredictable. Now, the part that I skipped over was the part that has to happen before this thing goes forward. I think that the senator and the governor's people and the assemblymen are going to want to know how the city, the county, and the town feel about this piece of legislation. And hopefully the draft that PARC gives the senator will be a draft that at least we feel there is essential agreement on things like, for example, how is the authority board going to be appointed, by whom and how many? How are we going to handle zoning? How are we going to handle building codes? How are we going to handle payments in lieu of taxes if this authority by definition is, as it should be, tax exempt? So there's all that wrangling that has to go on, but once we've reached agreement, it's pretty straightforward. And the last part I left out was the wrangling that goes on in Albany. I don't think anyone should delude themselves. If Senator Stafford is as great a leader he is, goes to Albany and says he needs this bill, he's going to have to give something to get something. He said that himself, privately and publicly. I think that's the way Albany works, and so that'll be an interesting process to watch. But hopefully by the time they're finished, we'll still have an authority that's essentially locally owned and locally controlled. Go ahead, one more.
Just one more addition to it. Have you had any thoughts on how you're going to handle fire protection?
When I'm an authority, when we're an authority, boy, I hope cheaper than I'm doing it now. Right now, we pay the city now. Sure, I'm going to pick on you for a second, so be nice.
Yeah, I'm doing.
Okay, I'll pick on the city now. We pay the city $11,000 a month to give us fire and ambulance protection for for 5% of the base, and we pay the South Plattsburgh folks $10,000 a month to protect the other 95%. So one of your fee schedules is off. I'm not saying which one, but one of them is off. That's $21,000 a month that I pay for fire and ambulance protection. Excuse me, I got to get in trouble again. That PARC pays. Now that doesn't include police protection. That's just fire and ambulance. I have to tell you that that contract was in place when my company showed up. In fact, it was just put in place. I understand there are all sorts of reasons for it, good and bad. We've got another 20-some-odd months left on that contract, and I'm not sure what's going to happen to the existing contract, and this is a matter of public record. The Air Force has told us they're not going to give us the money to pay the city or the volunteers until they start getting some very specific itemized bills. So we're about 2 months behind on our payments to the city and the volunteers because we're afraid that if we pay it, the Air Force won't reimburse us. And they're starting to get nervous. They're wondering why we're paying so much. They're wondering what they're getting for their money. You want to know what's going to happen when we become an authority. I can barely get through with what I got now. My guess is that if these contracts have expired, that we will have negotiated some other arrangements, possibly with the city and the volunteers. Maybe we'll get into the fire and ambulance protection business ourselves. I happen to have one slightly used and fully equipped fire department. Just no people. PARC happens to have that, not me. So I'm not sure, but I think those contracts, when they expire, if not earlier, are going to have to be renegotiated because $21,000 a month is a lot of money. So. Have I bored you all yet? Go ahead.
Something that I know. There is a cemetery on the base, which I assume is a national cemetery, or should be. And so what is the possibility of making that federal park with the barracks and a museum, and, you know, this is sort of what I'm talking about.
Well, let me say first of all, I love that cemetery. It's the only place where I can go and I get no complaints whatsoever. And I think there is a possibility that it's been tossed around and talked about for a long time, where we can combine the existing cemetery, possibly with a new cemetery for veterans, take the old barracks building, house some of our historical artifacts over there, maybe set up, you know, maybe antique shops, turn it into an antique village, if you will. I mean, it's beautiful out there. It's great scenery. It's great property. But so far, for whatever reason, no entity or group of individuals has come forward and tried to make that happen. And some of you might say, well, that's PARC's job. Well, yes, it is. It is. But we're concentrating first and most on things that create jobs. That's been the mandate given to me anyway by the PARC board, and I think the PARC board will tell you that's been the mandate given to them by the community. There's some jobs in that kind of a development, I'm sure, but it just hasn't gotten the attention and the time and the resources that it's deserved yet. Hopefully they'll come that day. I have to tell you, even that little appeal in our newsletter for people to step forward on this historical task force, I'm not sure that we got a single response yet, because I suppose everybody's busy and working on their own things. But it's a great idea. We just haven't done anything about it yet. So give me an F on that one. Sure, I'm going to go over to the deputy mayor here and I'll get back to you.
Just a question on housing. The gentleman asked a question, and you said that the authority would encompass the entire new base and that it would take on the golf course and it would take on all of the parts of that, but the housing portion, again, was not really emphasized upon. A huge portion of that land has housing on it currently. Is the government willing to knock down that housing and to keep it off the market, to open up industrial spaces for new buildings to go in, or are you going to market that housing in the long term? That's a question that has to be answered, and what PARC's goal is on that. I know the city has wanted a certain amount of housing, so we can open up industrial space in the city by moving the projects to the airbase. What is the status of the housing? What is the condition? Is all of the asbestos removed? And if not, who is going to pay that bill in the long run? That's a question I asked 2 years ago, and I still haven't heard an answer on that.
It's a very appropriate question. Let me first of all separate the housing into, there's 1,600 units, there's about 350 that are renovated, and I would argue that that should not be demolished. It's excellent housing. As you know, there are about, I think, 150 units inside the city. The rest is within the town on the new base. So speaking about the renovated units, again, I think if PARC had its way, the city would get the housing that's in the city, the rest of the housing would stay under the base, but it would be utilized only to assist a large employer coming into the area, and even then only temporarily. Now that could change in the future if suddenly housing becomes short. We're already getting calls from people saying there's a shortage out there and paying too much in rent, but that's the way I think we'd start. Now, but that still leaves about, what, 1,240 units out there. What do we do with that? Will the government help us in that regard? So far, the answer to that question has been absolutely, positively no. There's asbestos in those buildings, and there's lead-based paint in those buildings. In the Air Force, I think with some justification, have ruled that it is not a clear and present danger, that it is not a public health hazard. Okay? They'll clean up asbestos if it's friable, which means airborne, running around. The asbestos in these homes is in the tiles. The lead-based paint isn't chipping off, or if it is, there's no little kids living in these places, so that's not a clear hazard either. So far, they have been consistent, literally around the country, saying, no, we're not going to go in and do asbestos removal. We're not going to go in and take care of the lead-based paint, and we're not even going to help you destroy them. And they haven't. The closest we've seen in that regard is federally assisted deconstruction programs, where these places are not destroyed, they are deconstructed and then reassembled elsewhere. In fact, you may remember a little while ago we were having a great conversations and talks, rather well publicized I might add, with some of my Native American friends out at, I think it was Ganawage or someplace, or no, St. Regis. And they were thinking seriously about taking a few of these units apart and then reconstructing them back on the reservation where they needed housing. And that was of interest to them and to us because, you know, if you take down a house and it's got asbestos and lead-based paint in, you get all these rules and regulations. They're very tough. It's a real pain in the neck, or some say even lower than that, to get rid of it all. But if you deconstruct a home with asbestos and lead-based paint, the environmental regulations are less stringent. And supposedly the cost of deconstruction versus demolition is less. And of course, I think what the chief was thinking was at least, you know, he'd get a home out of it. We talked for a little while. They brought their experts in. I think in the middle of all that, they decided to take the Salmon River School District by force or something, and we haven't seen them since. So really, I'm not making fun of them. Nothing has happened. And so the short answer to your long question is the federal government ain't going to be there. And I hope the city keeps that in mind, because when you get those 150 units, you're lucky. You've got renovated units. You don't really have to do anything at all, maybe put in individual heating systems. And I've got PARC's got the rest of them, but most of those are trash. And that is a tremendous financial liability, and surely it is an environmental liability, because sooner or later they're going to have to be destroyed. And how are we going to do it, and who's going to pay for it? And I don't know. And I think that's another reason that if I were a city taxpayer or a town taxpayer or a county taxpayer, I'd want the state at the table, not me.
If these things have asbestos and they have lead paint in them, then they're not rentable, they're not livable, they can't be used. So a large majority of your base is not going to be available
The base housing, right?
for reuse, and that's a large portion of land.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I was reading in the paper the call to come out here tonight for an authority hearing, and using the housing and the amount of square footage available as kind of a bargaining thing against making the authority go, when these things really can't even be used anyway. I just thought it was kind of an odd way of using that square footage as a potential use when in fact it's not.
Oh, you're referring to these things being dumped on the market?
Right.
Okay. Well, understand something, though. We think they're useful. They're useless, okay, because we'd have to go in and put some money into it. If somebody from the area or an outside developer comes in and he decides to get into the slumlord business, he's in business. I think they can. I think they can. Well, you go out and look at them, but some of them you can. So, but the point is this, is that whether you agree that the housing is a potential asset, whether you think that the housing could end up on the market and damage the local economy, we could talk about that and agree to disagree. I think you have to agree that one way or the other, it's a potential liability. Either it gets dumped on the market or it sits there and rots. One way or the other, somebody's going to end up paying the bill. Either an existing landlord, because it was all dumped on the market, or if it isn't dumped on the market, then whoever gets stuck holding the tab for tearing it down and getting rid of the asbestos and lead paint. That was my point. I think that was the point in the ad or some of our articles. There's a potential liability there. So, go over here. Hi.
Me?
Hi, me.
All right, Audrey Walker, taxpayer, senior citizen, concerned citizen.
Those are impressive titles.
I would like to see the Plattsburgh Air Force Base not just used as a place for employment. I would also like to see it used, for instance, being a senior citizen, as senior citizen housing that would pay its own, not asking for PARC to pay or not asking the county or anything, but to be a pay on your own basis. This has been done in Vermont, Wake Robin. They've done an excellent job with a facility where you go from being totally independent to skilled nursing care. We have no facilities like this here in our area, nor do they have very many facilities like this in New York State. Secondly, and away from that issue, why has no mention been made that the city, the town, the county could work together on this? Why do we only have the city saying they want it for their use, PARC saying they want it for theirs, the town saying they want it for theirs? Why can't they work together and come to something that would be beneficial to all the taxpayers in the community?
Well, let me take the first question or comment first on senior citizens and housing. We have, as you know, just recently announced that we have given a rather loosely worded option to lease to Mark Purcell and Don Exford. These are two fellows, construction contractor and a developer who have been working in the Watertown area. And out there in the Lowellville, town of Lowellville, they put together a senior citizens community. It's a congregate living community, which includes a main building, which I think there houses 40 or 50 units, and then surrounding the main building, a series of independent living units, like duplexes or individual units. And they've been talking to us, and just this week, we met with them, I think on, or last week, Friday, and we've agreed to go forward. We've left the option in place. They have an attorney, they're working with a bank, and we are beginning now to draft the actual lease terms and conditions where they would lease land out on the old base, I'll say roughly south of where the cemetery is. And their plan is to build 44 to a 48 unit congregate living unit, which is a single building, and then 6 duplexes surrounding it. That would be the first phase. The second phase would probably be more duplexes and a military retirement community. And these are truly independent units. The people who want to get into these will have to be financially independent. They've told us that the average equity for a tenant would be at least $100,000 because you need $70,000 just to buy into them. You pay a substantial rent. And the congregate living unit is really neat because you get your own place to live, but you're in a large building. You share a meal, or at least one meal a day, with your fellow seniors, and somebody checks on you all the time. Well, if you're not ready for that, which is obviously a couple of big steps short of a nursing home, you could live in one of the independent units and have your own little flower garden. And you write 2 checks a month, one for the rent and one for your long-distance telephone bill. Everything else is taken care of. And you want to go shopping, somebody picks you up and brings you there. If you don't show up for a meal or your friend doesn't see you, somebody knocks on the door and check on you. There's certain amounts of health care on the premises. And these are for the seniors who have reached their senior years. The house is paid off, the kids are gone. Maybe they go to Florida 2, 3, 4 months a year, but they're tired of going to Florida and wondering if the furnace kicked on back up here in Plattsburgh. Or wondering if the paper boys stacking the newspapers up and advertising never cat burglar in Plattsburgh that you're gone for 3 months. And this is a worry-free, hassle-free environment for senior citizens. We are very excited about this project. It's on the old base. It lies entirely within the city. And we're talking to them. You folks from the city will be interested. We want them to make payments in lieu of taxes to us for the services that we render and to the city for the services that the city renders. So they will pay as they go. And they will be independent. And I think we're going to add $4.5 to $5 million to the tax base. And for the first time ever, I think, in the history of the North Country, these people who reach their golden years have a tremendous amount of spending money and also a tremendous amount of time and talent that they give to the community. Instead of exporting them to Florida, we'll keep them here at least 6 or 7 months a year. It's a great project. You're going to be hearing a lot more about it in the next couple of months. So, way in the back.
John, a couple of comments on the housing. If you weren't aware of it, several hundred units of Air Force housing have been relocated in the Dakotas to Indian reservations. And military personnel assisted it. I'm sure they didn't do it all.
They took it apart and moved it?
I'm not sure they took it apart or moved it intact. But
Where is this again?
In the Dakotas.
Somebody get that down.
I've got the newspaper article with me tonight.
Please.
The other thing, I don't know who did it or how it was done, but most of the base housing at Keys, the older stuff, has been demolished.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether the government paid for it or what, but it's
The
gone.
state plowed almost $50 million into Peace right after it closed. Wow. They put a lot of money into it. So. Other questions? Go ahead.
I'd just like to make a comment for the senior citizens. I have an aunt who lives in the units in Lowville that you were talking about.
Oh, really?
And it is a fantastic unit. They do a super job. They make sure everything's taken care of. They clean the units for you. It is really great. I've been down and visited her several times, and I'll tell you, it's a real plus.
How old is she, Jim, if I may ask?
90.
90?
Yeah. And she's living by herself and loves it. She can do what she wants. They take her shopping. They do whatever they need. And like you say, if she wants to go someplace for a month, the unit's taken care of. There's no problem.
The average age in that unit in Lowville is 81 years old. That's the average age. Yeah. And I've heard talk about, well, OLVA is thinking of doing something, and there's a developer out there, he's thinking of doing something. This is a market that has not been tapped. This is a market that has not been served. These are financially independent senior citizens, well up in their years, that aren't really ready to go in a nursing home. They don't need a nursing home, but they want the security, the comfort, and the hassle-free environment that these folks in Lowville are offering us. These are respectable developers. The prospectus that they have is approved by the New York State Securities and Exchange Commission. They're outstanding people with great references and a good balance sheet, and we hope that we can make it happen here. Over.
I've heard a number of interesting things. As a veteran and a historian, these areas are of interest.
retirement having 70-year-old sisters is also ludicrous. Even the idea of a federal cemetery for veterans is getting to be a more daily exigency for me. But as a...
We'll save a spot for you.
But thank you. But as a practicing economist, it seems to me that the competitive advantage that Plattsburgh has is not that it's way up here in the middle of nowhere, but that it's sort of between Toronto and Halifax and Montreal and Ottawa and Boston. And for the folks in Washington or Albany, it may be way the hell up in the end of the world someplace. But it is in a fairly central regional market. The one thing I've heard you address that sounded like new money coming into the area seems to be the same source that my father found money coming from as a businessman here 40 years ago. It all had funny colors and pictures of kings and queens on it, came from Canada. Recently, I was surprised to discover that apparently still most of the money in this county that comes from someplace else comes from the same direction.
Yeah.
You've mentioned contacting people regarding the airports in Montreal and whatnot, but I haven't heard a concerted approach. I've heard concerted approaches to DOD, whose funds are drying up, to the FAA, whose funds are drying up, to any instrument of government whose funds are drying up. But I haven't heard that other than a piecemeal approach, and Bombardier coming in, obviously, that there is a regional approach to Canada, which we're sort of in the center of a large population area, rather than being way up north, hell and be gone.
Well, let me talk first about being in the middle of nowhere. You're exposing a very embarrassing situation for me, because you see, when I'm in Washington begging for money, I tell them that we're in the middle of nowhere. And when I'm marketing, I tell everybody in Montreal that we're right next door. We're a suburb almost. So don't expose me too much, because John's in the back and he's involved in negotiations and the ramp down. But the concerted effort that you talk about, you said a concerted effort, you also said regional effort. There's a big difference as far as I'm concerned. The effort to market this base in Canada, let me tell you, has been concerted. And if referring to regional, you're referring to more than just Montreal. We have hit pretty hard in Quebec and Ontario. We've done trade shows out in British Columbia. We've done mailings all across Canada, depending on the industry they're in. I'm a big fan of direct mail, and I'll tell you my secret. We send out 3 letters to a CEO before we even pick up the phone and call him. And then we call him, and we tell him we're going to be in his backyard, and we will be there, whether he wants to see us or not, and we try and get to see him or her. And that's how we get most of our business, along with trade shows and a good word of mouth from the clients that we already have. So without getting into all the details of our marketing, at least for the past 16 and a half months, we've sent out a lot of letters, we've made a lot of phone calls, we've gone to a lot of trade shows, and we've entertained a lot of visits at the base. And not surprisingly, we have a number of tenants out there who hail from Canada. Just as an aside, I've had a number of people come up to me and tell me that I'm overly dependent and working too much in Canada, that I should look south of the border. I should go to New Jersey and Boston, and Massachusetts, and all those places. But the historical record here of the economy in the North Country is that if there's a manufacturing job to be created, it'll probably be owned by a Canadian. In fact, the numbers currently indicate that half of all of our manufacturing jobs in Clinton County are owned by Canadians, and 9 out of every 10 new manufacturing jobs is being created by a Canadian. So rather than try to change history, I'm going to go with it, and we're going to continue to market up there in a concerted way. We are sticking mostly to Quebec and Ontario, but we've been in other provinces also. So, jobs, looking for housing, figuring we've got it, why can't we give it to them? But for every one of those, I've got another person saying, wait, I work very, very hard to accumulate the money I have. I have this extra home, it's got 2 apartments in it, and if you put all your homes on the market, even just the 350 that are renovated, then I'm going to be hurting. And it's the old adage of, you know, who's got whose fingers in whose rice bowl, so to speak. And that's a tough one. It's very, very difficult. And go ahead, I'll give you another question, but let me just finish the thought.
It was, who's going to get this? Not rice or anything else. Is it going to be people that are here, whether it be the landlords that are going to benefit for it because they are citizens of Clinton County? Or is it going to be me? Or is it going to be some guy that's making $40,000 a year in Montreal for some firm that's just going to come down here and sit with his buddies?
I think the short answer to your question is that at least right now, the policy at PARC is given to us, if you will, by the community leaders, the business community, and landlords, and even homeowners, is that they don't want us in the business of giving housing to people who are already here. The possible exception is this low-income housing project that's over at Johns Collins and moving those folks over. They're in a project already. But generally speaking, the mandated park is not to be moving people or businesses from one end of town to the other end of town, because when we do that, we just leave a hole. We don't add anything. And I'm not unsympathetic to anybody out there who is in substandard housing, or anybody out there who's struggling like most of us are to meet our mortgage payments, our rent payments. But that is the consensus, I think, of the community right now, and I don't see it changing. So I'm going to be very honest with you and tell you, I think that's the way it's going to be for a while. I don't mean to sound harsh or cold. I think that's the challenge.
It sounds like I was saying that these people have substandard housing, but I don't think there's...
No, I said that.
Right now.
I said that.
I think that the housing is
But
probably...
I've had calls from people who want to move into a nicer place. Can't afford what they got now and don't like what they got now.
My problem is with the money. You're saying now you're getting all this money from the government, and this gentleman over here asked you when you're going to say what you're going to do with the housing. Well, I mean, you didn't really answer his question. He stood back up and asked you again.
Well, Dan was too polite to say anything, so I got away with it.
So I really don't, or at least maybe it just went over my head and I'm the only one in the room that didn't understand. But the only thing that I've heard you say that you were actually going to do with the housing was if you had a big business come in and bring a lot of their people in, which is not doing anything for the people that are here. You're going to give them, let them rent some of the house and give them back the money. Well, that's money that's in your charge, and I'm not saying you're not doing a good job, because who am I to know? Who am I to say?
I think your conclusion is essentially correct. We're going to use the housing to bring new people to the area, not to help the ones that are already here. That's exactly correct. I'm going to take another question. Can I give somebody else a turn, please? Over here, if I can pick that. Go ahead.
Ken Ellsworth.
Oh, hi, Ken.
I think the great concern amongst most of us here is the lack of cooperation that's been very evident for a couple of years between the city and PARC and maybe some of the other entities here. During the election process we've just gone through, we had professions of love and whatever. That's over now. We heard on the news tonight that there was a meeting today between the governmental agencies, the city, the town, the county, and I assume with PARC.
No, we were not there.
You were not there. My question would be, since we do have representatives of the town and the city and the county here, could we get an expression from them on their willingness to cooperate and maybe get this thing off the ground and do all of us a lot of good?
Before I forget, I want to apologize. Mrs. McGull, you brought up city-town cooperation, and I didn't really answer your question. I apologize. I think it's been bad, but I think it's getting better is the short answer. But why don't we get it right from the horse's mouth here? Is there a city representative or a county representative or a town representative who'd like to address that question? The question is, what are your feelings? Is there going to be more or less cooperation? We have the town supervisor here. Andy, go ahead. Then we'll go to the city.
I'll take a shot at the issue of cooperation. Discussion on an authority really started.
Right up here.
Thank you. Discussion on an authority really started at the end of 1996, I think. Mark came and talked to the town board, and I think he talked with the county. He also talked with the city. We also talked amongst ourselves. The city and the county and the town actually began talking a year ago. There were a couple practical difficulties. One of them being the difficulties between the city and PARC seemed to get in the way every time we started talking. I think that's been resolved to some degree, and I think that's going to help a lot. But I think the other bigger problem is the record of decision. A year ago, when all of us were talking, it was not only speculative about an authority and an entity, it was also speculative about what would actually be turned over. So to some degree, it was very difficult to come to any kind of conclusion. A big part of that speculation has ended now with the record of decision. I think if everybody looks at it, you're going to see exactly the format that the Air Force intends to turn Plattsburgh Air Force Base over to the community. Now that part of the equation is out of the way. Decisions can be made about the format of ownership. I think an authority, at this point in time, unless somebody's willing to come up with another idea, is the only practical route. The magnitude of the process is too large, I think, for any community. I was with Don Garrett and Clyde Rabideau today. Don, chairman of the legislature, made it clear in no uncertain terms that the county's not willing to step up and take it over. I don't think the city is willing, and the town certainly isn't willing to accept the huge potential liabilities of a failure of the facility. That leaves an authority as the entity. That's not a new idea. The city, the town, and the county went to the legislature and the governor at the end of right after it was announced that the base was closing, and asked for authority legislation. The governor deep-sixed that back then. The one good thing that did come out of that process was PARC. The community agreed at that time, between all the political entities and business leaders, a format for PARC and the representation structure, which is 7 members, and Mark discussed that. I think that's the single biggest battle, I'm told, in creating an authority is the membership and the governing body of the authority. Chris Orloff told me that took 7 or 8 months for ORDA. It took longer than that for the Albany County Airport Authority. That's out of the way here. Now we just have to get through the details of how this entity will, the governing structure and the actual organizational structure of the entity, and then sell that to the state legislature and the governor, who will create it and probably take a substantial degree of fiscal responsibility. I believe that we'll be able to agree between the 3 municipalities and have a package to our representatives early in 1998, so it can be acted on in this legislative session. And I believe, unless there's something else that happens between now and then, we'll have an authority prior to the deadline that the Air Force has established of December 1998.
Thank you, Andy. Would somebody from the city care to comment? Dan? Come get a microphone if you want.
Good job, Andy. The city has been steadfast in its stand on certain criteria that has had to be met in order for any authority vote to go forward. And I certainly make no apology for that. We are a bipartisan group, and we've worked together in order to make sure certain things were accomplished before any authority is signed off on by the city as home rule. I had the opportunity in January to meet with Mark and had lunch right before I went to Washington, where I met with the White House liaison to Interior and with the Assistant Secretary of Commerce to discuss a disputed lakefront property and also to discuss the housing situation. I also met with HUD officials, and then I met with someone from Installations. And the lady there knows of Mark very well, knows of our mayor very well, knows of the council, because every single article that's ever been printed in the Press Republican is in a little file down in Washington in Installations. And they asked me very simply, when are you going to get your act together and start to do things the right way up there and start to cooperate? Because that is the only time that you're going to ever receive anything in Plattsburgh beyond the money that we're going to give you to ramp down. So we call it, Mark, ramp down?
Yes.
To ramp down. And that's the only time we're going to really see any achievement here. It is recently, through the political process, that we saw certain statements being made by different individuals concerning this. I think Andy's right when he says we basically turned the corner. I think you're going to see a much more cooperative level between the town, the county, and the city, and that's because our deadline's approaching. You know, the time for games are over, the time for politics are over, and the city, as well as everybody else, has to get down to business and get this thing out of the way. That's the bottom line on it. I don't know what else to say on it.
I neglected to introduce you for him. This is Dan Sturdy's the Deputy Mayor and Mayor Pro Tem for the City of Plattsburgh, and Andy Abdallah is the Supervisor for the town. Is there anyone here from the county? an elected official from the county legislature? Oh, they have a meeting tonight, so I apologize on their behalf. Thank you, Dan.
I'd like to
Appreciate
say something, Dan.
it. Shirley? Shirley is a newly elected
I'd
city
like to
councilor.
say that as a new counselor, I don't take office, I believe, till January. But I do plan to get along with PARC, with the county, with the town. However, there are certain things, you can't just blame the city in this proposal tonight. I read PARC's vision of the proposed park authority is that the authority would be subject to town and city zoning ordinances. Sounds good, right? Go on and read, but only proposed use is contrary to the base reuse plan. That means that you don't want to be subject to town and city zoning ordinances. It's part of this community.
Well, give me a shot at explaining that. We have a base reuse plan that's imposed upon us. Actually, I'll back up. The base reuse plan was developed by this entire community, and I'm sure you were involved in the process. There were hundreds and hundreds of questionnaires and surveys, there were public hearings, and literally the community worked together for a period of months and months with a consultant, and they came up with an overall reuse plan for the base. And along with it, a bunch of experts were hired to do an environmental impact statement that covered what had happened in the past and how this reuse was going to work. This whole process was so extensive, so formal, and so strict that just recently the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation ruled that as long as what we do out there is in compliance with the base reuse plan, that we actually satisfy New York state law with respect to the State Environmental Quality Review Act. And I might add that so far, both the city and the town have voluntarily ruled on their own that they have no zoning jurisdiction out at the base. So when we say to you that we'd like this authority not to be subject to city and town zoning ordinances unless we violate the base reuse plan, we do it for a couple of reasons. Number one, we consider this base reuse plan our plan, your plan, everybody's plan, because we all put it together. But number two, we have a mandate from the federal government that says if we don't comply with the base reuse plan, they can come back in. For example, right now, if part of the base reuse plans it says this particular building can be used for aviation or for an industrial building, and I decide suddenly I want to turn it into a daycare center, they have the legal right to deny us use for that building because that's not what's contemplated in the reuse plan, because the environmental cleanup was good enough for an industry but not good enough for a daycare center. And so what we're worried about when we make that proposal is a situation that could very easily happen where you prohibit us from doing something that the Air Force says is the only thing we're allowed to do. We could be between a federal rock and a city of Plattsburgh hard place, and we somehow have to resolve that. Let me just finish the thought, Shirley. So what we've proposed in this authority is that we're going to stick to the reuse plan, which this entire community put together, and I don't think you should abandon too quickly. But if for any reason we stray from that reuse plan, then the city or the town, whoever has the jurisdiction, will be invited to come in and we will abide by their zoning laws. And on top of that, even though we're going to abide by the zoning laws, we will, within a year of the authority's inception, pass a specific land use regulation that the city has to approve in the city portion of the base, the town will have to approve in the town portion of the base, and you'll have the specifics say about actual land use. So let's look at it practically. The base reuse plan that says this area is going to be industry. The entire community agreed to that. But the land use plan will say, and your buildings will be no higher than this, your signs will be no bigger than this, your side yard setbacks will be this big, so on and so forth. So we're not taking control away from the city or the town. What we're saying is recognize the work that we've done, that's been done already, that we've all done together in the base reuse plan, and bring the town and the city in where the base reuse plan doesn't work, or where the land use regulations aren't there, and they aren't there, and we'll put one in and you can approve it. I mean, I don't know what else we can do, because if I abandon the base reuse plan, I got the federal government after me saying you can't do that. So you tell me what the solution is.
But you've already put it in a nutshell.
Yeah, but
if you use the base reuse plan, you're not subject to zoning regulations set forth by the local area. And I'm under the assumption that once you form an authority and the state legislature's control board okays everything about it, you then become an authority. You're a power onto your own mark. Let's not kid ourselves. And if you're not subject to any of the local zoning regulations or requirements, I find that scary.
Well, Shirley, I think you should read what's in front of you.
Well, it's the same thing, Mark, as, you know, one of the problems with the city of Plattsburgh, as I understand it, just from reading the newspapers and speaking with different people, is they wanted the waterfront, right?
Wait a minute. Before you switch subjects, you're going to be held accountable once. Just listen to me. It says right here, and this is what you have in your hand. In addition, the Park Authority, Park's vision of the proposed park authority is that the authority would be subject to town and city zoning ordinances, but only if the proposed use is contrary to the base reuse plan. Now, how do you interpret from that sentence that we are an authority unto ourselves? What this says is that if we're not in compliance with the base reuse plan, then the city takes over or the town takes over. On top of that, it says later here that we will put together a basic land use plan, and we won't even put it in effect unless you've approved it. How can you possibly sit there and say that we are an authority unto ourselves and we are ignoring the city of Plattsburgh? This is the kind of stuff that I've had to put up with for 18 months, Shirley, and I'm not going to do it anymore.
Mark, I'm not saying that.
Well, then read what is written and say what is true.
Well, what I'm trying to get across is, this idea to me smacks of the same thing as the Park Authority has said they voted to turn over the waterfront to the city of Plattsburgh. But in essence, according to what's written here, it probably doesn't mean anything.
How can it not mean anything?
Well, there is also a serious legal question as to whether the passage of state legislation could ever obligate the U.S. Air Force to cooperate with this proposed transfer.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what that refers to, that at least initially, Mayor Rabideau proposed that in the legislation designed to create an authority, there should be a clause that says, Park will give the lakefront to the city. Our legal people and our politicians are telling us that if Park wants to give the lakefront to the city, Park and the city should do a separate legal agreement. You do not go to Albany, ask for a piece of legislation that creates authority, and stick into it something which is purely a local matter, which is the transfer of the lakefront. We will sign in blood, if necessary at this point, an agreement that says Park will give the city the lakefront, okay? You can pass all the acts of the state legislatures you want, and I've got news for you. Not a one of them is going to force the Air Force to go along with it. That doesn't mean the Air Force isn't going to go along with it. We've already talked to the Air Force, and we've told the city, we're going to ask the Air Force to transfer this property over to the city. You will get your lakefront. You will get your housing. Give this community the authority. Yes.
I've been following, my name's Ralph Martin. I've been following this PIDC and park things for 4 or 5 years now. And I think all of you who spoke tonight, gentlemen back here who asked the question about when people are going to start working together. Andy Abdullah here made the comment that we're at the point where we met today and are going to begin working together. Dan Stewart over here made a crucial point. Time is running out. It is really running out. The military looks at decommissioning ships and closing Air Force bases as a very practical matter. It's an albatross, and we've got to get rid of it. And we have the very nice opportunity in this community to take 4,000 or 5,000 acres and all the buildings and do something very productive with it. Dan's point, time is of the essence. And the discussion that you two just had makes the point to all of us that you don't have the luxury anymore to continue these dialogues. You need to have somebody who can coordinate between the town and the park and the city and the county, who has no vested interest. There's no way the park can coordinate this. Mark's a lightning rod. There's no way somebody from the city can do it, because the city people are lightning rod. You've got to come up with somebody with some sense and some experience to make the rounds. Once or twice a week, make the rounds. Do a little educating, do a little cajoling, do a little pleading, and once in a while do a little head knocking. But Dan made the point, you guys don't have much time left, and we in the city don't have much time left, or the town, or the county. So please, for goodness sake, let's get on with the program. The authority's the only answer, and that was the only answer 4 years ago when I interviewed for the PIDC. We've come around to it.
Thank you very much. And sure, I apologize if I lost my temper. My frustration, and I do apologize, I didn't mean to yell at you, but I just feel that I'm running a race, and every day somebody moves the finish line. You know, one day you got to give us the lakefront, and then we hit that. Well, you got to give us the housing, and now you come back and say, well, you got to do this about zoning, and now you got to do this about taxes, right? And the finish line just keeps moving, and I get so frustrated. And I think, frankly, and I'm not an elected official like you are. I wouldn't get elected a dog catcher in this community, but I have a feeling out there, just from the people I talk to and listen to, that the rest of the people are getting as frustrated as we are at PARC. When is the finish line going to stay still so I can run through the tape, declare the race over, declare you folks the victory, and move on with the redevelopment of the base? It's very frustrating for us.
My whole point in the beginning, when I said it, was, are we going to allow Washington, we're going to allow Governor Pataki to take care of it, are we going to take care of our own people? That's our whole point. Are we, as a community, going to rally together and do the job, or are we just going to sit around and bicker? That's what we're doing, bickering like a bunch of little babies. We're going to bicker, let's bicker.
Now, don't lose your temper, because you'll have to apologize.
I'm just fed up. I mean, I'm running political gamuts, whatever else you want to call it. People want to bicker about politics, do your politicking outside the door. Let's get the job done and let's do it. Let's support the man. And let's pass the damn thing.
Shirley, you got to interrupt.
Right now that I think I am for an authority. My only concern is that, you know, I did a little research, not much, but a little. And I like the idea of what, for instance, Saratoga did with their city center. They gave themselves 25 years to succeed or not. And I think that's sufficient time for anybody. And I like the idea that once they were done, you know, their initial purpose, that they got rid of their liabilities, sold their bonds, and then reverted all that back to the appropriate areas who would then have no liabilities, like environmental cleanups and stuff like that. That's all.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Another question right here, sir. The one who's had the light in his eyes all evening. I apologize.
Okay, Jim Bailey from City. Can you tell us a little bit about Olympic Region Development Authority or other authorities that might be similar to what you have in mind? How, for instance, in Lake Placid, it covers both the village and the town properties.
Ned Harkness is older than I am, and the comparison stops there. He runs the Olympic Regional Development Authority, or used to, I should say. The airport authority that we have envisioned here is not patterned after the Olympic Regional Development Authority, the New York State Highway Authority, or even the North Country, the Development Authority of the North Country up near Watertown. What we patterned it after is the legislation which created the Albany County Airport Authority, which I think, if you'll check, runs fairly smoothly. It hasn't gotten too political. The Albany County Airport is a booming, prosperous airport. They've done very, very well. They've received assistance from the state, but they've also generated their own revenue stream. They have the power to issue bonds, which is what the Air Force wants in our case. And that's the legislation that we've loosely patterned our legislation after. But we would like to tinker nevertheless and make sure that the appointees to the board are acceptable to all three of the jurisdictions, that issues that are complicated like zoning and building codes are properly addressed, so on and so forth. So that's what we're looking after. I can't speak with great expertise on exactly how order was formed or the development of the North Country Authority or any of those things. I can only tell you about the Albany County Airport Authority, and it seems to be a very workable tool for us. And I might add, it was created in the state legislature with little or no problem whatsoever. So that's probably not exactly what you want to hear.
An authority can issue bonds.
That's correct.
Cannot tax.
No, it cannot tax. Not the way we've got this set up. We can issue bonds based on anticipated revenue. We can issue industrial revenue bonds, but it by itself has no authority to tax. We can charge fees to our tenants, obviously, charge rent, you know, that type of stuff. But that's about it. So, over here, John?
Marcus, question of comment. I agree with Shirley O'Connell that if you were to put sunset provision into your authority, I think you would have pretty smooth sailing.
I think you're probably right. It's not something that I'm opposed to. I might even shorten it if it had got this thing through. I'm just terribly afraid that, you know, we're not going to meet our deadline. And at this point, as I think you can see, Park's willing to put just about everything on the line to keep this redevelopment effort going. We've got the beginning of a very nice dream. We'll never see it fulfilled unless we move forward. Way in the